So I want to start off by thank you all for the opportunity to be here. And I know my mom, my sister, my husband, and my family is watching because my watch is going off right now. So hey, everyone. Uh, and I will be remiss without saying hello to them because my career in health and wellness started because of a couple of things. My mom and my granny is a nurse. And my idea of what it means to do healing work started from there. The twang that you hear is real, so it's so good to be back in the South. I'm from North Carolina. And so being able to be grounded and to be in a place where I had brown gravy last night, thanks, Steenie, it was just an amazing experience. So yes, thank you. But also, being back home is also reminiscent of why I do the work around ATOD, because my father's addiction started as a young child. He was an amazing football player and got a scholarship to Wake Forest University. Also an amazing, really, really smart human being. But because of his addiction and how we approached the crack epidemic, I'll talk briefly about that in this presentation, he didn't have access to how we approached the opioid epidemic. So he lost his football scholarship. I wasn't on any of the lovely Housewives of Atlanta or anything like that because he didn't make it to the NFL, which he was projected to make it to. Amazing athlete. He actually was projected to go to the NFL, and my mom had us at 18. And so because of that, we were community raised by our family. And my mom had to have a decision on what to do, so she went to nursing school and followed in my grandmother's footsteps. So you can imagine an 18-year-old with a set of twins, what are you gonna do? And you can imagine what everybody said, what we were not going to accomplish. And because of that, we are both first-generation college students. But if you Google Dr. Elbert and Dr. Sheree Watkins, you'll see a story that just came out about both of us. My twin sister is also an associate vice president of student health and wellness at the University of Utah. She also has her first couple of degrees in health promotion like I do, but her second 2 degrees are also in counseling and rehabilitation with the emphasis in substance abuse. I always start that off when I do my work around ATOD because what was projected to be deficits for us was propelling us to be part of the ministry, the work, our vocation in doing this work in various settings. She's worked in community-based work in a hospital doing Ryan White. She's worked with chronic disease. I've always worked in higher ed. And I always talk about that, and I wanted to emphasize that since I know this is recorded for the students and the professionals who will watch this, and in those moments where we feel like they are forgetting to give us the resources that we need, or we're in that class and we feel like maybe we can't do this no more, that somebody will scroll and watch this part of the video and feel encouraged to keep doing this work. Because your circumstances, the trauma that you may have experienced is not the end. It's the beginning of what you may be called to do. And I'm sure many of my family and our friends and our mentors didn't see that we would both end up in these positions, but I wanted to start that and ground this conversation because I didn't see this as a possibility. And I'm hoping that you all will take some of this information that I'm bringing. It's not all the work that I've done. It's the work I've been able to partake in with many colleagues, some here, hey Carol, some I've been able to work with over the years and learn from and grow from. So today, I'm going to talk about a couple of things, how to describe prevention to recovery and some strategies that it's inclusive. We can do things better. We have done things better. And I'm hoping to challenge you all's thinking, especially from historically underrepresented students. And I will describe what I mean by that, not just by race and ethnicity. I'm going to talk about that from a variety of ways. I'm going to briefly talk about some racial injustice and how it impacts health risk through social determinants of health, and how some of our campuses are approaching it. But I'm going to end with one of the most critical components, which is our recruitment and retention strategies, specifically for Black and Indigenous professionals and those within diverse perspectives in our field. So I wanted to start off with how to define health equity. I've been doing a lot more diving into health equity because a lot of times in higher ed, we talk about doing work from an equity lens, but they tend to do it with our partners over in the academic side. And when I think about the departments in my portfolio, Certain departments talk about equity and certain departments don't. And when I get all 4 of my departments at the table, we don't talk about equity from a unified, holistic lens. So I always tell them this: if a student is walking through any door, they don't care about our degrees, they don't care about which department is going to serve them, they're usually confused. So how do we make sure through a literacy lens that they understand how to approach our services, use our services, but more importantly, pass it down through their family and support persons, because literacy has to be generational. And access to care is a privilege. So if we're going to build equity into our services, that means we're going to build it with the literacy framework so that way they can use it on our campuses. If they're referred out to the community, they can understand how to use it, but more importantly, they can pass it down. So we talk about equity from the lens of achieving and removing obstacles, which we know in higher ed, that is a huge thing that we have an issue with. And it also looks at how we address poverty and discrimination and consequences, which include powerlessness, the lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education, housing, healthcare, and safe environments. And I'm going to talk about some of those safe environments because when we plan and do programming and prevention, and then we ask the question, well, why don't they show up? Well, did we create the environment for them to show up? So I'm going to start off the conversation there. But at American College Health Association, we started these conversations during the pandemic when we had the first equity conference. But earlier this year for NASPA Strategies, we had a panel as a few of my colleagues and I are working on a health equity framework for higher ed that we hope to publish soon. And BK on the panel during the Q&A, somebody asked, well, how do we do equity in higher ed when we haven't addressed this framework? And his comment was, no amount of wellness will free you from an oppressive system. So we have to do something. And the room was just completely silent. And then he further started to talk about nobody questioned us going to the moon. We just did it. Nobody questioned all the things that was considered impossible. So when we talk about equity in higher ed, why do we question it so much? We should just start to do it. Then on the other end of that, years from now, we'll actually have those systems and structures in place. So I teased out within the African American community, because I already had this slide, what the short history lesson has looked like specifically for the African American community when it comes to how generational trauma started. And I'm going to talk about it just this specific community, because if I talked about every specific racial and ethnic community, that would be the whole presentation. And that's not what I'm here for. But if we talked about African Americans in the continental US, from post-traumatic slave syndrome to present day, I often ask my staff how we don't consider this in our programming, from prevention, treatment, and recovery practices. Because if all these things have happened and are still happening, why aren't we addressing it from our lens? And when I think about the lens piece, oftentimes they're like, well, what do you mean, Dr. E? We're still redlining, they're still stop and frisking, there's still mandatory sterilizations happen. Then I can start bringing in other communities for the mandatory sterilizations, and that's for those incarcerated. That was happening during COVID. Then we start seeing removal of children from parents. There's my brown communities, my indigenous communities. So when I see all of this happening, my next question to my team is, but these are the students coming to our campus and the recipients of generational trauma, but we want them to come to a Weeks of Welcome program like this just didn't happen to their family members. Like, substance use is not impacting them. The outcomes of this history is not impacting them. And all of a sudden, they just dropped off all of this trauma. So now let's start with my presentation. We have started to build a system in higher ed that has centered trauma from a crisis approach. We wait till the students show up in crisis. We act like none of the things that have happened from an identity-based trauma lens, and then they show up in faculty, advisors, dean of students, police, and then we react. They go through our bid team, our care teams. Sometimes it's our community partners who actually call us and say, hey, I have your student. And so now we're more reactive to the trauma of the student. Sometimes they've been incarcerated. And so we become more trauma responsive, and we're good at it because we've done it for so long. I did a presentation yesterday, and I asked the group of professionals, it was all 4 departments like I have, when did they think this started? And people started listing events. They was like, oh, about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, Virginia Tech, 9/11. They were just listing events. And I was like, A, B, C, E, all the above. All those things have impacted how we approach the work that we do. It's not just one thing. And I said, so how do we go from this approach to an upstream approach? And it starts with, 1, coursework. And with these type of conferences, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Or my favorite, since I'm back home, how do we get to the root? So my question to you, if to start you all thinking, what are we watering? I gave you a hint already. What are we currently watering in our fields? Just start to process. If you showed up in a meeting, what is constantly the first thing we're talking about? Is it the crisis? Or is it actually addressing the systems and the structures impacting our work? Crisis, systems. If you go into system and structures, raise your hand. Very rarely do we get to the systems and the structures. But most of us are being reactive and getting to the crisis of the work. And when you are focusing on the crisis, I'll call that the leaf work. It's so beautiful. It's the leaves. Sometimes you get to the branches, maybe even the trunk. But we rarely get to the root, or as my family may say, the root. Because when you get to the root, you get beyond what you see. Where are my clinicians in the room? Licensed clinicians, or soon to be licensed. You're working on it. We know historically, those who are diagnosing, if you haven't been trained to do your diagnosing with the cultural lens, with specific communities, you tend to have concerns with wrong diagnosis, correct? If you haven't trained to work with that community. You also may have an instance of treatment. With the group I worked with yesterday, I gave them a vignette from my sister about a student, because again, I told you all she worked with those with chronic disease, and there was a student who came into student health with sickle cell. Now, I teased out some of the identity pieces, but gave them everything about what happened in student health. Student showed up in crisis, in pain. They was like, took blood work, student's fine. Student next day goes to the ER, and they're like, wait a minute, vaso-inclusive, we need to get them in the hospital, has pneumonia. And I said, all right, clinicians, what happened? It was the person of color who said, was she Black? Yes. Historically, most people with sickle cell are of African-American descent. So then we started talking about historically how they're not believed to be in pain, how they're least likely to be prescribed pain medication. So let's talk about perception versus reality. And I was able to share, as a substance abuse therapist, my sister has run a Suboxone clinic, how her job is to teach those in chronic pain or those who have been working through their addiction and still have a chronic disease, how to mitigate that pain. And so I may not show up bowed over, barely can walk. So you assume because I can stand up straight and flat-footed that I'm not in pain. but isn't that the job that you want me to do, to be able to still function? So how do we get beyond, as clinicians and preventionists and healers, of doing leaf work? How do we get beyond our own bias? Because if we've been trained to wear masks, we can't do good work. And that's what I'm constantly challenging my team, to get to a point where we are constantly doing the work with an equity-based lens. So I think about the root work, it allows us to start looking at trauma, core beliefs, social determinants of health. And for those who work in higher ed like I do, when I say social determinants of health to my true higher ed folks, they're like, huh? It's like Charlie Brown, wah, 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 wah. So I started to say basic needs. I started to say Maslow's. I have to speak their language. So also for you all who are trying to blend your work with traditional higher ed folks, you have to also, in public health, meet them where they are. Learn their language so they don't also zone you out at the same time. So these are common questions I start doing. So this is, for those who don't know me, this is my teaching side. This is your homework. So in your meetings, you're not constantly doing crisis conversations. This is how you start to prepare to do equity work. Can you answer these questions? Who are the students of today and tomorrow? What has impacted them? Because if you don't know what has impacted them, we can't do the work to serve them. And if those who were on campus when COVID hit, some of you saw your colleagues sitting around tables and saying things like, we can't send them home? Because it never occurred to them about social determinants of health, that their home wasn't safe, they were food insecure, technology insecure. It was out of sight, out of mind. And here us public health folks, and that includes clinicians and preventionists, was like, we've been saying this for like how many years? But it took COVID. So if you can answer these questions, that is how we start doing equity work. But a lot of times we don't start asking these questions. The other part for those who work on campus like me, if we're still doing the same programs, initiatives, and treatment focus from 10 years ago, now, we can't serve the students of tomorrow. So let me give you some examples. If we are still doing the same programs, specifically around prevention, bystander intervention, and we know some of those programs didn't include people from historically minoritized lenses, those who were neurodiverse, differently abled, because they were forgot about. They were not included in those studies. We can't do good work. Because those people who determined what was evidence-informed didn't look like the students that we're serving now and in the future. Many of them were first-generation students. They didn't know what it felt like to live in the financial aid office. And when the package wasn't right, I was singing every hymn sitting in that line. Like, I hope I get this certain financial aid officer. Or my favorite, how do I still save money and make sure mama gonna be okay? And my baby brother back home. It's always interesting when we talk about financial literacy and how to teach students about literacy, but we forget about there's still support and family back home for some of their students. But I think about the same thing about evidence-based versus evidence-informed. Who is defining that? So we think about the work we do around substance use, who's still defining what's evidence-based? Are we still using that evidence-based structure, research, now when we absolutely know that N wasn't diverse? And why? It still baffles me that we still cite those people because we want to be included versus to do things differently. And I get it. Tenure track is a goal for many. But we are still using systems and structures that was built to be not inclusive. I think about the Pen 3 model when I was working with my students in my program planning class. They all choose the same theory, bless their hearts. None of them chose this as a model for their program planning project. And so I introduced them to this one, especially for the ones working with specific communities and specifically around substance use. And I wanted to show you this example because even though it's in their textbook, they still didn't choose it. And so I think for those of you who are engaging with students, whether in the classroom, through their internships or fellowships, sometimes the work you have to do is also introduce those options to them. They tend to pick a theory, a framework, a model that's comfortable for them. And so some of my work has been introducing a model like Pen 3 that centers and influences and can overlap things that can be inclusive around culture and identity that they may not naturally choose themselves. And so I wanted to emphasize this as an example when we think about evidence-based versus evidence-informed, that sometimes the work of an educator, a supervisor, especially with those who are supervising students, can include that. So let's start getting into some pieces of what have I observed around some of those prevention pieces. We are still doing what I call cookie cutter prevention programs. Somebody created it. You created it. Somebody said it was great. Now we roll it out on our campus. But true prevention programming allows somebody to create a great program, but we still have to tailor it to our students. We forgot that part. Thank you for creating it, but you still have to take it and tailor it to our students. Creating professional development around multiculturalism, cultural humility, DEI, social justice is necessary. Our staff have to know how to work with different populations. Many of our programs don't necessarily do, our academic programs don't do it. Some of our staff haven't been given permission to be authentic in previous settings. If you want it, you have to give them permission to do that. And usually when I say, I want you to show up as your authentic self, I'm getting a side eye like, is she being for real? Because workplace trauma is real. And if you're doing this work around anything that has caused trauma, such as alcohol, tobacco, drugs, or any forms of addiction, they're carrying it with them. And then those who do the work, we carry it with us. And so oftentimes when I say, I want you to do this work from an authentic place, it's a lot of fear. Am I gonna get in trouble? Am I gonna make a mistake? And then more importantly, harm reduction versus abstinence only. For those working in higher ed, it depends on the type of campus. If you are working with campuses and colleagues who are at religiously based campuses, you just have to learn how to work with them within those parameters. And I need our academic programs to start helping you all learn how to do that type of work, because that is a reality. I don't think we understand how to work within the lines. They teach us how to work outside the lines. But to do good work, you have to do both, because they still need help. And oftentimes in those institutions, they can't do harm reduction. So how do you still help them? So some key takeaways: do something different. Start by talking with those communities that you're not serving, those students of color. And that requires you to get outside your office. Don't ask them to come to you. This is a heavy slide, but I wanted to make sure that when I send this out, you all have it. There is a connection with bystander intervention and alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, specifically for communities of color. Because this third bullet talks about, well, the first bullet, the history of the anti-violence movement Many of them were formed and led by Black women and femmes. But many of the cookie cutter programs we wrote out on campus are not inclusive of Black and brown Indigenous communities. Because one of those key things of bystander intervention programs includes calling the police. But no other options are included. There are programs, there are people doing good work, Third Bullet, Swan Center for Advocacy and Research, the Black Women's Blueprint, Chimmy Boy Keys, Women of Color Network, the Me Too movement. There are others doing good work. We need more people to keep doing good work. Again, so we can flush out ways to do bystander intervention tied into the work around ATOD that is inclusive with an equity-based lens. We still need these programs around bystander intervention when it comes to prevention, but if we don't find a way to be inclusive in them, many communities will say, this has nothing to do with me, and I don't want to be a part of it, especially when it comes to sexual violence. Treatment. A lot of things have increased. I'm seeing more collaboration, increasing harm reduction strategies, increasing diversity of clinicians, providing anti-racist training has increased for now and those who train in the future. But I have some suggestions. We still have to address some decades of violence, poverty, stigmatization, and the widespread incarceration and generational substance use. Some more sensitivity to the approach to identify social determinants of health. Many of the SODH assessments that can be used in the clinics in the community have not been tailored for the clinics of a student health center. So how do we do that? Who wants to create it? It's waiting for you. It's prime and ready. There are good ones already for a traditional ambulatory care, but not specific and tailored for student health. Many of the clinicians now who are retiring from student health centers have done good work. Many of the ones coming in are coming from traditional ambulatory care centers, ERs, minute clinics. They are great, but now we have to get them used to working in a college health center. Integrating addiction treatment within primary care, case management, infectious disease, and gynecological services. All those things are in a lot of the student health centers. But as much as you all do the work, you all know that unless the provider goes for extra professional development, they have no clue around addiction.
That's right.
So how do we get them trained to assess while a student is coming into student health? Versus, well, let me send you over to counseling, because they're least likely to walk over there if they're not in the same building, or if they don't have an embedded counselor in that building. A lot of times it's that uncomfortable feeling those providers have because they don't have the extra training. They don't have to, in health education, we don't have to be an expert. We do have to be knowledgeable. How do we have that same mindset with our medical providers? Who wants to create it? There's so many gaps in some of this work, but I think there are some easy fillers so we can do this equity-based work. The onus for some of this is on the student versus us as the professionals. That includes having a culturally sensitive intake. This is my sister's slide. Thanks, Ray Ray. I like to make sure, as a preventionist, I'm still mindful of my clinicians, because you all need just as much support too. And she's done this work. She's worked in a hospital setting. She's worked at the School of Medicine. And she's led teams that had social workers, licensed therapists, psychologists, MDs, PAs, nurse practitioners. And she led those teams with her LPC. Go ahead with your bad sip. Mm-hmm. So how do we do it better in higher ed? Again, how do we not do any harm by specifically, we still hear it, not having a colorblind approach? Not seeing an entire culture through one lens. Not putting the burden of teaching on the client. So those who are in leadership, how do you build it into your meetings so they're not crisis focused? I build it into every meeting. I also have what I call extended leadership team meetings. So I'm not just meeting with my directors, I meet with their leadership team. So I have a meeting every other month, directors, assistant, and associate directors. If you want to teach, you got to teach. So if I want to make sure it's funneling down, create the practice. I also, every quarter, attend their staff meetings, their whole staff meetings. You just can't say it. You got to walk the walk, talk the talk. Be mindful of the use of CBT. It's not the best approach because it can invalidate those concerns around race-based stress or trauma. So, slide from my sister again, more appropriate approaches for race-based trauma. Here you go. CBT is great, but it's not the bee's knees for racial trauma, because I don't want to cause more harm to students. And then they have the best form of telephone, thanks to social media. It takes one bad experience from a student in one of our services, and it's a done deal. Some other tips on how we can have an equity-based approach within the work that we do. How do we provide holistic healthcare within our services? And that can include on and off campus. How do we address some of the gaps in care to prevent, so we can have and ensure continuity of care? And that continuity of care doesn't mean our campuses have to provide everything. Continuity of care means what can we provide on campus? What do we refer off campus? How do we communicate that out? How do we be trauma informed? How do we provide wraparound services? How do we include them, those historically underrepresented populations, at the table? How do we honor and foster resilience? Some students need resiliency. Some students need to know how to expand the resiliency that was passed down. So TERO 2006, SOTERO, has a framework that talks about historical trauma. But in the middle of his framework is the good stuff. And one of the good things outside of psychological, physical determinants of health, the bad stuff like high blood pressure, diabetes, one thing that is passed down is protective factors and resilience. So for those of us who do this work, if we don't honor the resiliency and protective factors that were passed down, we forget to honor what was good, despite the bad. And so we do need to honor that some students need resiliency. Some need to be informed that they are already resilient. How do they expand that resiliency based on where they are now and where they are going? We have to be mindful of the words that we use. How do we address those social determinants of health within alcohol, tobacco, and drugs? Specifically because by the time they get to our campus, if they're able to get in, remember those conversations? Working with our collegiate recovery communities, trying to get them on our campus if they already have a felony was the first step. But once they get there, how do we support them if they need support around those other resources? Because some of them on breaks still go back to those same communities. Just like we do the backpack program in K through 12, what have we set up for our students? The students whose parent and support persons are still in either active addiction, in recovery, where's their backpack? On my breaks, we would sometimes go home and see our father incarcerated. Where was my backpack? I think we forget that we have the support services on campus, but when they go home on breaks, and some of our campuses still close the entire campus, they have no backpack. So if we're going to put the social determinants of health as a structure in how we do good work, how do we actually enforce it and use it as a part of our continuity of care? Again, we can't be all things, but we can do some things. How do we educate and serve and treat the whole person based off their needs? Again, that's why I'm not a fan of cookie cutter approaches. So if we know students are coming in already had an addiction, dealing with an addiction, has relapsed, had family who are dealing with addiction back home, have already experienced some form of homelessness. How do we support the whole person when they come to campus? How do we be mindful of their identities and experiences? I think sometimes at least for those who have traditional higher ed experiences, we don't want to ask because we think we're going to embarrass the student. But if we actually ask, we can then provide the services to support them. I think a lot of campuses found out the hard way how many students were food insecure when they created their food pantry. But now they're seeing that many of their alumni and donors fully support feeding their students. Other things consider: religion and spirituality, family support within guidelines of FERPA, sign the waivers. How do we help them with deployment assistance? Our career services are great, but sometimes depending on the student, if they have other barriers such as a criminal record, how do we still help them? I don't think many of our career services are prepared to do that type of work, specifically around ATOD. Medical treatment and housing assistance. And again, holistic approaches, looking from spiritual religious leaders, our medical professionals, our psychologists, LPCs, LCSWs, recovery therapists. Are we incorporating somatic therapies and interventions, our peer support and community leaders, and our university or academic researchers? It has to be that whole systems approach. But what happens is a siloed approach versus a holistic approach. Like, we got it, y'all got it, we good. And in true fashion of doing good work around ATOD, each area has done good work. The spiritual religious leaders have created their own forms of 12-step. Academic researchers are doing good research. And somatic therapies and all these things are working, but we have not built them cohesively together within our communities. How do we set the stage? These for those of us on our campuses and those in the community too. Have you done a user experience from your client's lens? And what do I mean by that? Have you walked into your space and actually experienced what it's like to make an appointment, walk through your space, sit down, fill out the intake forms? We are doing those things in my departments. We are learning a lot. I did not know this is an inundated process. We also have had the same thing done to our websites. And we've had students do it. And you know some of our students have no filter. So user experience is an actual type of assessment. If you have an assessment person, they can work with you to do that type of assessment. How do you greet them? Thank you for asking me how to say my first name. It was so simple, Shawnté. Simple ask. Did you make eye contact? And from some communities, that is not only a sign of respect, but it's a spiritual connection. And if you don't look them in the eye, ooh. When I did my work in Brody School of Medicine, we brought in a curandera to train our medical providers. And I remember sitting in there after we brought the curandera in, and they were training the medical providers who wanted to work in the rural medicine and teaching them about Mal de Ojo and had the egg. And I promise you all, it was the most amazing experience that the medical providers learned. And the first thing was, you will look them in the eye, you will touch them, or the whole thing is just not gonna go well from the rest of their appointment. And they were like, what? You will engage in a conversation. And I've tried to look everybody in the eye since I've been here. I have never lost sight of that. How you make people feel is very important. How do you set the stage? Even for those who say, you know, I want to do this work, I want to start speaking. Even when I walked into this room, I walked through the room, I did my prayer. How you do this work is how you set the stage and how people walk into your space. People who read energy will feel what you put out there. And when we start getting into building rapport, how you fix the mistrust and focus on your team's strengths is really huge for me. But I want to transition to my favorite part. We talked about recovery, but I really want to dive into our collegiate recovery communities. They are growing, they're prospering, but there's one piece I want to talk about is more guidance on risk management. Because a lot of the growth of recoveries has also given a gap on who should supervise them, who should be in them, who should not. Should they have a licensed therapist? Should it be a peer mentor focus? Should it be coaching versus counseling or all the above? And what I'm noticing is it's really just based off the campus's preference. But now that I'm in this role, and it's always a conversation about risk, I don't think I thought about that as much as a health educator. But at this level, I have to think about that. And I never thought I would. And with collegiate recovery communities and programs, I have to encourage us to start having those conversations. If you have unlicensed folks doing work around CRCs and CRPs, I encourage you to have conversations with your legal team on your campuses to make sure you are covered. It is one of those things that as I moved up the org chart, things that I wasn't aware of, I'm now fully aware of when it comes to risk management, when it comes to fully supporting students, when it comes to engaging the student at every level and their support persons, the parents. And I don't think a lot of times when we do work that some campuses do and don't, recovery is one of those things that I remember when we started ours at Charlotte, it was, we don't have it. We don't have students with recovery issues. And it was, we don't want to have that type of thing on our campus. Why do you think they didn't want to have that type of thing on our campus? Or type of students? So when you have those type of conversations, now it's, should we have naloxone on campus? Should we be passing it out? Have the conversations, talk about the risk, so that way, as you move forward, you've covered your bases and protected your staff. I don't think we have talked about that enough, but I encourage us from this space to start having those conversations, because as a preventionist, I never thought about it. As an administrator, it's something I talk about on a consistent basis. Same thing when it comes to policy, but I want to skip down to my last topic, hiring practices. If you're doing virtual hiring practices, be mindful of your paper documents. And what I mean by that, if you're going to use them, make sure they're consistently being used. And what I mean by that, if you're using questions, use the questions. When you're talking about camera ready, cultural experiences, accents, different expectations for women candidates, those who are gender nonconforming, non-binary, I have seen so much come up in, especially during COVID, and virtual interviews that never came up when everything was face-to-face. Be very mindful of what you set as the standard during your interview processes and what's considered professional for a candidate. Always having somebody to sit from the outside, like just sit there. They're not part of the interview team who can just listen. It's a good way to understand what bias is naturally occurring in your interview process. And this is one of the presentations I do about professions of color when it comes to workforce issues, leadership issues, empowerment issues, educational issues. And I'm pretty sure it's the same thing for other historically minoritized identities and for women who are either parents or guardians or supporting, like actually supporting their parents. These things come up and are often faced and come up during the interview process. Another thing to be mindful of, qualification title mismatch. Now, everybody has the same title. So be mindful of how you disqualify somebody because their title is not what you think it should be. Always look at the bullets. Leadership experience is undervalued, especially for those of in higher ed. You think they should have a certain type of title, certain type of experience, but every campus is different. Employment location and environmental burden. People of color must weigh racial and ethnic culture, campus climate, community climate when assessing a job. So you may not get that type of diversity that you want in the pool. So you're gonna have to be intentional in doing recruitment. And this is the worst one. Perception of job hopping, especially for people of color or underrepresented populations. In order to move up, they had to move out. Fifth campus. So job hopping is something very different versus I've been in the job for 15, 20 years. And I've heard it come up even more now as a sign of we don't want that type of person. We want them to stay. Well, give them a reason to. I've also had quite a few people reach out of, if I move up, can I still be a parent? Can I still have a family? Can I still travel? We have to be very open in how we discuss expectations for the type of role. And I just had somebody do it yesterday. So how do we level set expectations and how we match it with the job? So again, more importantly, I see a lot more of the bandwagon. It just takes one person on the committee to start off with something and the rest of the people just kind of roll with it. So who's ever chairing that committee, be mindful of how you lead the conversation. Just some data. How do you disrupt the bias? Become aware, evaluate, intervene, increase accountability. My favorite part of being an administrator is the checks and balances, and I can stop a search. If you feel like the process is not going in an equitable way, stop it, check it, start it over. I think historically that has been something not done, but it creates a culture of respect when people know that what was the old way of doing things is no longer welcome. Be mindful of how people perceive people of color. Angry, aggressive, overqualified, bougie, uptight professional, not the right fit, does not speak well enough, trying to take over the office and demanding, especially if you're doing reference checks. I always get qualifiers for why they make those statements. What do you mean? Well, they didn't perform well in their interview. I didn't know they were going for an Oscar. What were you looking for? Some people are coached and mentored to perform well. So how do you get beyond that? Some of the things you can do. Representation is important to the campus community. So here are some key takeaways in your retention and your recruitment strategies. Some of the things I do on a recruitment process, large listservs, do intentional outreach. If I meet people here and I'm like, ooh, I remember you, let me do an outreach. I will send you an email. At a conference, I'll be like, ooh, so-and-so told me 2 minutes ago. I literally was at a conference in January, met an AVP. He was looking for a DEI health equity director for his team. I said, 1 second, I got a person, she is here. I said, come upstairs. Introduction, just got the offer. Use your privilege with intentionality. That's connection. Retention strategies. Check in with your team, see where they at. If they're ready to go and you can't keep them, support them in that so they can do above the ground searches. Look at their resume, look at their cover letters, help them. They'll make them feel like they have to do it behind closed doors. Also, avoid stereotypes. Train your search committees, build in accountability measures, evaluate your interview questions and practices. One of my favorite things to do for the first round is to give the questions for first round in advance. Then everybody can do the first round on an equal playing field. And what you're measuring is they actually do their homework to show up prepared versus can you trick them with a question. Second round, if you have 2 rounds, is the open round. And I got that idea not from doing a search in a traditional prevention model. I got that from being on the search committee for a tenure track faculty position. And I put that in my pocket and have been running with it ever since. Just a cheat sheet that you'll get of some other tracks that you can use when it comes to recruitment and retention. Take what you need, as we say back home, eat the meat, leave the bones. Mm-hmm. And then questions for you. Same questions for the students, same questions for your employees. So with that being said, here's some last tips for you all on how to support students around with an equity lens. I already talked about most of this, about supporting the whole student and how to do it from an equity-based lens, specifically to higher ed. I've talked about every single one of these specifically, but more importantly, here are my lessons learned. It is better to take the time to conduct assessments to learn the strengths and areas of growth that might impact outcomes, especially when it comes to ATOD. Take the time to do the work. Failure to assess can result in an unplanned failure. Selecting the right staff is crucial. Take your time with your searches. Address the decades of violence, poverty, and stigmatization. Please evaluate and determine the effectiveness of what we consider to be evidence-based and who determines it. And collaborate with and work within your communities. You can't do all the work on campus. You have to include your communities within the community.
Okay, can we give a round of applause for Dr. Elbert? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.